Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody listening in. A warm welcome to this online event reflecting environment, sustainable development, biodiversity in the multilateral trade context. My name is Marianne Kettunen. I am a senior policy advisor and head of partnerships at the Forum on Trade, Environment and the SDGs, TES for short, and I will be your moderator today. The world continues to be in turmoil, but it is a hopeful week for the global biodiversity agenda. After a long wait and delays due to the COVID pandemic, the negotiations on the global biodiversity objectives of 2030 have finally resumed in person in Geneva. And this means that we are on our way to adopt a new global biodiversity framework before the year is over. Therefore, it is a very timely moment to also talk about global trade, sustainable development, and biodiversity, and explore the role trade policy can play in delivering the 2030 biodiversity objectives. On one hand, there is a great concern over the threats to nature arising from current trade trends and policies, including the role they play in deforestation. These concerns, they feel particularly relevant when we consider the many failures in reaching the set 2030 global targets that we just missed the deadline by a mile a couple of years ago. On the other hand, there is also an increasing recognition of and also interest in seeing how trade and trade policies could support the delivery of global biodiversity goals, chiefly by promoting more sustainable supply chains moving forward. So building on this backdrop, the aim of this webinar is twofold. Firstly, we want to give a brief and rather informal, very conversational update on the environment-related discussions at the WTO, including a number of new initiatives on environment and sustainable development. We want to reflect how these discussions create opportunities vis-à-vis the global biodiversity agenda moving towards the 2030. Secondly, we also do want to introduce you, whom I think there's a lot of biodiversity audience listening in, to some of the key organizations working on these very issues at the heart of the capital for multilateral trade, that is Geneva. We hope that this will facilitate future engagement and cooperation when you start to know the players that are in Geneva working on these matters. Few information points before we start and I introduce you to our panelists today. This webinar is taking place in the context of the Trade Hub initiative, and it is a part of the Trade Hub initiative's Trade and Nature series. This also means that the session will be recorded and will be made available on the Trade Hub YouTube channel for you to watch later. We will hear more about the Trade Hub project later, but for now, I just want to thank the Hub for hosting us today. Also useful to know for the people listening in that we have opted today to try to give you as much information and food for thought as we can in 1 hour. So therefore, we do not really have a dedicated space for Q&A on the agenda today. However, we really do encourage you to use the chat function if you're listening into Zoom, share reflections on material with us on the panel and also with the whole audience if you wish to. So with these introductory words, with this scene setting, and without any further ado, let's have a conversation with our experts today. To begin our conversation, I would like to introduce you to Daniel Ramos. Daniel is a legal officer at the Trade Environment Division of the WTO Secretariat. Now, WTO Secretariat has many roles, and one of which is to liaise and cooperate with international organizations, including those working on environment and biodiversity. Hence, the Secretariat is one of the key actors to know for the biodiversity community as well in Geneva. And therefore, we are really delighted to have Daniel with us today joining us. So welcome to Daniel. Daniel, my first question and the scene setter goes to you. So could you help us to have these conversations today and tell us what is the state of play on environment at the WTO? What are those new WTO initiatives on environment and sustainable development that people are talking about? How do they work? And also, how are they unique? And focusing perhaps on one of them, the one on trade, environment, sustainable development, what do we know about the work and timetables going ahead? So with that, Daniel, welcome and over to you.
Thank you, Marianne. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Thank you for inviting us. Let me start by saying that I have to say I agree with the description of your event. That we do live in a particularly important and opportune moment in the history of evolution of trade and environment debate. Hopefully, the audience knows, last December, we've had 3 ministerial statements being adopted at the WTO, highlighting the important role trade can and must play in addressing key environmental sustainability challenges. And this came after years of increasing interest, discussions, and action by WTO members on environmental topics. And this both at the WTO, for instance, we have a committee on trade and environment where discussions have picked up in last years, but also importantly, regionally and domestically. Just to give you an example, we have an environmental database at the WTO, and it shows how trade-related environmental measures notified to the WTO have significantly increased in the last years. We already have about 1,500 measures notified by WTO members since 2009 to support biodiversity and ecosystem conservation. These are trade measures adopted for environmental purposes. So it's clear that our members see trade policy playing a role in supporting biodiversity and ecosystems conservation. And this movement, this increase in interest does not respect the traditional real or perceived divide between developed and developing countries. Not only these measures that I mentioned are adopted by developed, and LDC members, but developing and LDC members comprise more than half of the members supporting at least one of the 3 WTO environmental sustainability initiatives that I mentioned, whose ministerial statements were adopted last year. And what are these initiatives? Well, we have first the fossil fuel subsidy reform initiative. This is endorsed currently by 45 WTO members. We have the second one, the informal dialogue on plastics pollution and environmentally sustainable plastics trade, or IDP for short, which is co-sponsored by 70 WTO members right now, representing roughly 75% of global plastics trade. And finally, the one you mentioned, the Trade and Environmental Sustainability Structure Discussions, or TESD, with 71 WTO members representing about 84% of international trade. So here's where I also agree with a second point in the description of your event, because these initiatives, they offer a renewed opportunity for constructive and concrete engagement from the environmental community, not least the biodiversity and wildlife conservation. As the focus these couple of weeks currently correctly is hopefully on agreeing to the outlines of an ambitious post-2020 global biodiversity framework, there is also an opportunity now to have a fresh look at the relationship between biodiversity, trade, CBD, and the WTO. In a sense, the relationship and cooperation between our 2 systems is one of the longest and strongest in the area, dating back to the origins of CITES in the 70s, CBD in the 90s. We have, from the secretariat perspective, we have a very close relationship between the secretariats with CBD Secretariat, often briefing each other constituencies, helping whenever asked to clarify issues and find opportunities for mutual support in this. From the delegation side, CBD and biodiversity issues have been often taken up by WTO Committee on Trade and Environment, other committees at the House, and trade issues, on the other hand, have cropped up in CBD negotiations. Now, I have to say, historically, technical discussions have focused on a set of more legal issues, such as the relationship between the WTO's trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights, or TRIPS agreement, and CBD issues such as indigenous knowledge or access and benefit sharing. GMOs, gene editing, the Cartagena Protocol, invasive alien species, and our agreement on sanitary and phytosanitary measures, or the technical barriers to trade, for instance. And finally, a lot of discussions on positive and negative incentives and what is the relationship with our WTO agreements covering subsidies regulation. Now, pretty much a rules-based or rules-focused discussion. I personally believe that with the new post-2020 GPF, while these issues will not disappear, they will continue to be important, that is an opportunity to chart an even more positive and constructive or proactive, in a sense, agenda of cooperation looking at how trade can be part of the solution to reaching the objectives and targets set by the CBD, for instance, on sustainable use, sustainable trade flows, facilitating access to key technologies and services for conservation and restoration, or market access for biodiverse goods, concrete steps to addressing harmful subsidies, and increase sustainable trade capacity, just to give a few examples. And this takes me to the final point and the answer to your second question on TESD specifically. And what I'm saying to TESD, it reflects a little bit of what is happening for IDP as well. So you have a good idea of how these things work. The group has recently adopted a work plan for 2022 with at least 3 more meetings planned for the year. The next one, by the way, is scheduled to take place at the end of the month on 31st March. And a high-level stock-taking event in December of this year to review progress achieved, including, for instance, on potential partnerships in relevant areas, and adopt next steps towards MC13, our ministerial conference in 2 years' time. So a 13th ministerial conference, when they hope to have concrete outcomes. Now, the work will be supported by 4 informal working groups covering topics in the TESD ministerial statement, namely on trade-related climate measures, environmental goods and services, including how to better engage developing countries and LDCs, circular economy, and the 4th group on environmental aspects and trade impacts of relevant subsidies. So in the language of the CBD, on the incentives, harmful and positive incentives, right? And capacity building and technical assistance will be discussed across horizontally the groups. But as you can see, there are plenty of opportunities and relevant contact points with biodiversity topics. In effect, if you look back, IDP co-sponsors have already briefly discussed it last year, how international trade and the promotion of sustainable food and agriculture should take into account the protection of biodiversity while also contributing to elevating the living standards and conditions for rural workers. And in their ministerial statement itself, co-sponsors note how efforts are being undertaken to address issues such as sustainable trade in wildlife, the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity, and sustainable oceans and the blue economy. So to finish, just by saying that, as I said, indeed, this is quite an important juncture. I've been working in the division for 7 years, and this is different. It feels different. So I would welcome you to keep an eye for developments at the WTO going ahead as members try to find ways to improve the role of trade for sustainable outcomes.
Fantastic. Thank you, Danielle. You have really set us off in a good, comprehensive path towards the discussions. As you say, it feels different. I think that's the message we're going to take from your talk moving forward now, and also moving forward after this event. To recap, 3 things, also for our audience perhaps that isn't so well versed in the trade talks. So what we hear from Danielle is, firstly, there's increased interest in the members of WTO who are adopting trade-related, environment-related measures. So, and we have data to show this, increasing interest from the countries to work in this space. We also now have these initiatives, new discussions that provide a different space to actually converse on these topics, which Danielle mentioned. And when we look at one of them, the TESD one, as he mentioned, we have their climate, we have environmental goods and services, circular economy and subsidies to be on the agenda for this year, all of which have links to biodiversity and entry points to biodiversity. And finally, and really importantly and interestingly, what Danielle was highlighting to us is that there is a long-standing cooperation discussion between the CBD world and the WTO world or secretariats to build on moving forward with the 2030 biodiversity agenda and broaden and look at the trade's role, which is also a very good starting point for everything. So that's kind of where we stand. And I see Danielle nodding, so I'm not doing too shabby of a job to summarizing this. So that is great. So with that, thank you, Danielle, so much. We're going to move on to the next speaker and panelist. That is Beatriz Fernandez from UNEP. So Beatriz is an associate program manager working at the Environment and Trade at UNEP. And in this role, Beatriz also leads the public policy engagement component of the Trade Hub project that is hosting us today in Geneva and beyond. To the community that we are speaking today, perhaps mostly biodiversity stakeholders in the audience, UNEP hardly needs any further introductions, but perhaps it is useful to make a note that UNEP has been working in a trade environment interface for many years. And in addition to the work on plastics that UNEP is perhaps the most known for in this space, UNEP has also been actively working on biodiversity, including exploring how to create more comprehensive vision for the trade policy in a post-2030 global biodiversity context. So really speaking to the point that Daniel was making, that this vision, this cooperation between the two worlds can be broader. So Beatrice, welcome to you. And I would love to ask you next, what opportunities do you and also UNEP see in the integration of biodiversity into the trade discussion moving forward, reflecting perhaps particularly the TESD initiative and discussions where those number of work streams provide openings for biodiversity conversations. So Beatrice, welcome, and over to you.
Thank you, Marianne, and thank you, Daniel, for providing us with this positive and encouraging overview of how we can move ahead the agenda of trade and environment. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Good afternoon from Geneva, Switzerland, and welcome again. So, as you know, trade policy can play an important role in promoting the protection of biodiversity. And following on what Daniel shared today, there are important discussions on trade and environment in the multilateral setting that have gained importance and is providing an opportunity to address and also advance the global biodiversity agenda. And I'd like to highlight here in my short intervention two important considerations to integrate biodiversity into these trade and environment discussions in the coming years. So first, as Anya already highlighted, in 2022, members of the WTO structured discussions on trade and environmental sustainability will focus on 4 thematic areas. And I will mention some opportunities that are emerging for biodiversity here. One of them is on trade and climate related issues. And as we know, environmental challenges driven by climate change are also disturbing natural habitats. In 2021, the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services and the IPCC, they produced a joint report that confirmed the intrinsic linkages between climate change and nature. This report highlighted that previous policies have tackled climate change and biodiversity separately. However, protecting biodiversity can also help us adapt to climate change. Therefore, addressing these synergies between trade and climate change and biodiversity can also help to minimize the impacts, the negative impacts in biodiversity, while fostering healthy ecosystems that are more resilient to climate change, but also that bring opportunities to maximize social and economic benefits and help achieve the UN Sustainable Development Goals. There's a second area on environmental goods and services, and it is important that facilitating trade in environmental goods and services is guided by understanding how trade can address pressing environmental challenges across the board, including, of course, the biodiversity agenda. Trade cooperation should facilitate and promote trade in environmental goods and services, creating opportunities to participate in sustainable supply chains, where the impacts of trade on nature and biodiversity are addressed, including higher attention on how to promote environmental sustainability of agricultural trade and also trade in commodities, looking as well as how to support businesses and exporters from developing countries that are already producing sustainable bio-based products. There's a third element on circular economy and has already been mentioned, but it's important to shift and support the shift to circular economy, looking at the full cycle of products. This including how trade policy can be used as a tool to help this, to help reduce pressures on the environment and on resource efficiency and use, including the pressures that are imposed on biodiversity. There are opportunities arising by looking at the full life cycle of products, as I just said, but also seeking to promote new business models that help us reduce resource use, that help us eliminate unnecessary and wasteful consumption, and importantly, that help us reduce impacts on biodiversity and regenerate ecosystems. There's a fourth element on the TESD discussions about subsidies. And it's important to note that this year, the Business for Nature and the B team, they launched a brief that is called Financing or Survival. And they reviewed a wide range of environmentally harmful subsidies across sectors. And they estimated that the world is spending at least $1.8 trillion a year on subsidies that are driving the destruction of ecosystems and species extinction. Likewise, last year, UNEP, UNDP, and FAO, they published a joint report that found that between 2013 and 2018, the support to farmers totaled an average of $540 billion a year. And out of these, 87% was harmful and was a huge damage on climate and nature. And this farm support included price incentives for specific livestock and crops, subsidies for fertilizers and pesticides, and a strong distorting export subsidies and import tariffs. Therefore, the subsidies work at the WTO discussions on trade and environmental sustainability will be very important to assess how trade can help in this reformation of harmful subsidies that also creates opportunities to improve people's health, to tackle climate change, and obviously to preserve and protect nature. And there's a second element, and here I conclude, and has already been mentioned by Danielle and also by you, Marianne, the Convention on Biological Diversity, CBD, and the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. The CBD provisions and international trade are linked through the production, the transformation, and the commercialization of biodiversity-based goods and services. That also creates incentives for the sustainable use of biodiversity. There is not a direct requirement for CBD linked to international trade. However, the Conference of Parties have asked the CBD Executive Secretary to closely interact with relevant committees of the WTO on issues of mutual interest that also include assessing what are the impacts of trade liberalization in biodiversity. On the other hand, as has been mentioned, the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, it aims to set out an ambitious plan to implement action that help us transform the society's relation with biodiversity and fulfill this vision of living in harmony with nature by 2050. To achieve this, the framework, as it is currently proposed, has 21 targets and 10 milestones for 2030 that include trade issues covering wildlife. As we speak today, in Geneva, Switzerland, as many of you know, there are resumed sessions of the third meeting of the open-ended working group on this global biodiversity framework. Among key proposed targets of this framework that have a direct trade relevance, I will mention some of them. One is on the redirect, repurpose, reform, or eliminate incentives that are harmful for biodiversity. Another is on having areas under agriculture, aquaculture, and forestry that are managed sustainably. And a third one to reduce nutrients lost to the environment by at least half, pesticides by at least 2/3, and eliminate plastic waste discharge. And I end here with this comment saying that the future global biodiversity framework provides both an opportunity but also a need for increased multilateral dialogue and cooperation on trade and biodiversity related issues. This also to ensure that all countries participate, that they benefit from global efforts, so we can all together help halt and reverse biodiversity loss and a sustainable use of biodiversity resources. Thank you, Marianne.
Thank you, Beatrice. And thank you for starting to go into more detail as to how the trade agenda and the conversations now happening in the environment space in Geneva are linked to more concretely what are the conversations in the biodiversity space, including a number of targets foreseen to be part of the future framework as well, which are directly linked to those conversations, which we will, as communities, have to understand better in order to actually work in the interface and make the interface work for us as well. So that was a good start for that, and merits a webinar on its own further down the line. But now we're going to move on to our next panelist and speaker, who is Sofia Murphy. Sofia is Executive Director of the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy, IATP for short. And IATP is a think tank that works on sustainable food agriculture systems globally, including looking at the role of trade in shaping these systems. Now, we all know, and also that's what Beatrice highlighted, is that shifting to a more sustainable food systems and agricultural practices plays a crucial role in delivering the global biodiversity agenda, including there are those specific targets in the foreseen 2030 global biodiversity framework that try to ensure to make this happen. And we also know that trade plays a significant role in steering the agriculture and food systems globally. So that's why I have asked Sofia to join us today, and I was very delighted that she said yes. So welcome, Sofia, to today's conversation. My first question to you is, what kind of opportunities do you see at the WTO for trade as a driver for sustainable agriculture and food systems, having heard from Danielle and having heard from Beatrice earlier? How do you see, based on your considerable expertise in this space, that the current conversations can take us forward, finding synergies? So with that, Sofia, welcome over to you.
Thank you so much, Marianne, and thank you, Tess, for the opportunity to be here at the Trade Hub. I'm speaking today in Minneapolis, so I'm pretty far outside. It's been a few years since I've been to Geneva, but have a long time history of working, especially on the agriculture agreements. And I think I wanted to start quickly by saying, to define the opportunities, I think we also have to agree on what the challenge is. And coming in from a long history of working here, which maybe not everyone who's immersed in biodiversity has done, from my point of view, I think that first we see that biodiversity losses and climate change both are making trade both more important and more complicated. And I think we're seeing the extent to which the rules we have don't serve us. And so I think there's a real challenge to the existing rules on how they are going to adapt in the face of what we're learning. I think the most recent IPCC Working Group 2 report shows us that we are in a crisis. And not just trying to forestall one. And I think that as trade gets more important, we also see heightened risk in trade, especially when countries think about it from a food security perspective, where biodiversity is folded into a whole lot of other things that are often more short-term and immediate, but of course, impossible to have food security without protecting biodiversity. And we also see that I think that one of the biggest challenges will be, how does the trade system provide the insurance that countries need to engage in this necessary trade in a riskier context? So there's a whole lot of things there to sort of get at. And then from there, I see opportunities in having the dialogue, just seeing trade and other systems talk, which has not always been easy, other parts of the multilateral system. And I think maybe some opportunity to redefine what it is that we want from our rules-based trade system. So just thinking about it from an agriculture point of view, I would put into question some of the big fundamental principles, like least trade distorting as an essential determinant of whether a policy is a good or not, useful or not policy. Partly because it's impossible in the end not to be trade distorting in some way. Importantly, because the WTO has chosen to define trade distorting around the role of the state and state interventions, but the negotiators have ignored all of the trade distortions that come from the market itself and all of the failures of the market. And I suspect those of you working in biodiversity have a lot of experience in ways in which the economy fails our environmental objectives. That's why we have circular economy and other initiatives like it. So we need to find a way to get at probably not to get rid of distortions, all of them, but to at least understand that state intervention is sometimes correcting market failure and a necessary intervention, and that there are many failures on the market side, lack of competition, no restrictions on investment, and how those are made sustainable at the same time as we try to make production itself more sustainable, that we'll need a bigger conversation about what we're protecting and how we're protecting it. And I think another opportunity, which is also a challenge for the WTO rules we have, is how we understand returns to agriculture and how we see them dispersed. So one of the challenges sustainable agricultural production has is that returns to farmers are often very poor, and the money in the system, which is plentiful, is made elsewhere in the value chain. And it becomes very difficult. A lot of our interventions, like the subsidies, we talk about the environmentally and otherwise destructive agriculture subsidies we have, are not helping to ensure that returns to agriculture reward long-term investment in the sustainability of what's produced. It tends to reward either increased production, but small, and it tends to reward certain particular crops feeding into fairly centralized and not very diversified food value chains. So I think with the opportunities quick, the question of fossil fuel subsidies is an important one. You see that now with the invasion of Ukraine from Russia, the two big commodity markets affected are wheat and oil. And it's not a coincidence that these markets also connect in important ways, because a lot of the agriculture that dominates international markets is highly reliant on fossil fuels and fossil fuel products. So looking at those subsidies and how we unpack them, there are huge opportunities, I think, to make our use of land more sustainable. We've seen with the COVID crisis in particular, the pandemic, a big influx of public money into our economies. For me, that's an opportunity for a different conversation with the public about how we use our money, what we want from our economies, what looks sustainable. So I think that public money also puts into highlights the public money that was already being spent, the report that Beatrice mentioned. And I think that there's a bit of it's been a long time coming, but I think the political sort of deadlock that held a lot of agriculture subsidies in place is breaking down. And the biodiversity conversation, I think, might prove a better or another new important instrument to break that apart. Trade has not managed to do that. The agreement on agriculture failed to really change the basis of the subsidies provided, particularly industrial countries, but actually now picked up by some developing countries as well. And I think maybe the last thing I'll say, and it picks on something that Beatrice said as well, that I think from an agriculture point of view, the biodiversity conversation is a really powerful way in to making production more sustainable, a little bit in contrast to climate change, where we see a lot of single outcome proposals, sequester carbon in soils, or, go for something that will strictly reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but ignore all the trade-offs that I think are more obviously on the table when you have a biodiversity agenda. And that when we go in protecting biodiversity, and here I'm talking about soil biodiversity, on-farm biodiversity, not just forests and other sort of systems outside of agriculture, I think you can both be sequestering carbon, doing other things to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but at the same time protecting the viability, economic and environmental, of the farm systems that we have. So I do see a really important role for biodiversity to, in a way, temper our climate change, and enrich would be perhaps a better word, to enhance what we're trying to achieve, where climate change has driven a big kind of new opening into our policy debate. I think biodiversity is an essential piece of how we round that out and make it do all of the things we want it to do, and not get stuck on a single kind of global objective, but something that takes into account the diversity of different countries and different needs.
Thank you, Sofia. And also thank you for doing exactly what I asked you to do when we prepped for this event, which was also to look at some of the challenges which we just do need to identify in order to really provide meaningful solutions to work forward in this space of two worlds sort of coming together with slightly both working for sustainable development and sustainable development goals, but somehow from a slightly different angle, which we need to reconcile and be able to work around with, when we also look at the measures can be staying in this place. So that was very helpfully clear and highlighted in your intervention. In the interest of time, I think I'll have to move on and pick up another speaker. So we will do just that and have a bit of a, as I said, whirlwind tour around, organizations, people, experts who've been working in this space for quite a while. So our next speaker is going to be Lorena Jaramillo. Lorena is Economic Affairs Officer at the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, UNCTAD for short, and she's working in the Division on International Trade and Commodities. UNCTAD has surely been one of the change agents for trade, biodiversity and sustainable development over years as well. UNCTAD has been promoting sustainable trade in biodiversity products and services as part of their biotrade initiative since the 1996, which is over 2 decades. And as such, UNCTAD has been one of the trailblazers in demonstrating how trade and biodiversity can be a tool to deliver global biodiversity targets in concrete manner. So as you can see, in our kind of a lineup of speakers, we're kind of moving more and more towards concrete things as to how the potential of trade, biodiversity interlinkages can be brought alive on the ground. So with that, I would like to welcome Lorena. Lorena, I'd love to ask you, firstly, for those who are less familiar, perhaps, in this virtual context, could you summarize very briefly what UNCTAD has been doing and the strategic ambitions of the UNCTAD's trade? And also then building on that, what opportunities do you see moving forward? Thinking of these new discussions and openings at in the WTO context, how can it support the work that the UNCTAD has been doing and these supporting biodiversity and trade? So with that, Lorena, I welcome you and thank you.
Thank you very much, Marianne, and thank you also, Tess, UNEP, and the Trade Hub for the kind invitation to be here with you today. So, good day to everyone. I will start a brief description of what is UNCTAD. Well, it's the main organization within the United Nations systems that deal with trade and development. So we help developing countries participate more equitably in the global economy. And to do that, we provide analysis, facilitate consensus building, and offering technical assistance. That is a little in a nutshell what UNCTAD does. And in relation to the work of biotrade and how Marianne was mentioning, in over 25 years ago, and a response to Agenda 21, UNCTAD launched the Biotrade Initiative that aimed to support countries to effectively address biodiversity loss while generating livelihoods through the promotion of sustainable trade and investment in biological resources, in line with the 3 objectives of the Convention of Biological Diversity. So conservation, sustainable use, and access and benefit sharing. For over 25 years, we have developed expertise of how to actually work on the interface between sustainable trade and biodiversity, but also we have worked with partners at the national, regional, and global level, created programs and even a network of organizations right now in 100 countries that support and strengthen the biodiversity-based sectors, supply chains, but also companies. And in order to ensure that it's biodiversity friendly and contribute to livelihoods, the support that we do is based on social, economic, and environmentally sustainable criteria. That criteria is what we call as the biotrade principles and criteria, and are a set of guidelines that support governments, companies, civil society to develop their activities in a way that conserves and sustainably use biodiversity, generate livelihoods, particularly to the peoples that depend on those resources, but also foster the economic diversification and development of countries, and where we use really trade as a major engine to support this work. So throughout the years, we have been supporting countries, for example, governments in developed national programs. The national programs include areas where we normally collaborate, like for developing a sector, addressing, creating an enabling policy environment where you have maybe gaps or duplicity that hinder the trade and the development of businesses that use biodiversity sustainably. We also work with partners like ITC, who Anna will tell you as well, who help companies also access international markets or implement sustainable practices in their supply chain. So it's really practical information. We help sustainable sourcing activities, even funding in some cases. And at the end of the day, it's really, we want to demonstrate how trade, and if we manage it sustainably, can be an engine to create incentives for biodiversity conservation, generate income for communities, and also generate revenues for countries. That is a little bit in a nutshell, how do we work in biotrade. And just on the future, as you know, late last year, UNCTAD had a ministerial conference, UNCTAD 15, and member states agreed in the Bridgeton Covenant. And through this covenant, UNCTAD was mandated to continue contributing to the successful post-2020 global biodiversity framework. We have been doing that for over 2 years in supporting, providing inputs, organizing workshops, mobilizing the biotrade partners, but also working with other UN agencies, trade and environmental entities to build the case on how and the positive role of trade to the conservation of biodiversity and the important role that it can take to contribute in the post-2020. So we have been doing that for the past years. We are really looking forward for the adoption of the post-2020 in COP15, but also we don't have to forget, we're in the formulation, we like to have what's next. We have to already start preparing and providing tools and supporting TPD parties and member states in its implementation. We also have to keep that in mind. How do we support them to implement so that we have a positive achievement of the objectives of the post-2020? And then going to the third question, in the interest of time, the opportunities that we see from the test discussions at the WTO, and considering also the roadmap and the planned activities, we think from a biotrade perspective, this provides us opportunities to contribute and engage further with the discussions and with member states. For example, it can enable to raise awareness, enhance also the understanding and the mainstreaming of the importance of trade, policy, and making trade sustainable to contribute in reversing the biodiversity crisis, while supporting the objectives of the CBD and the post-2020. We see 4 main areas in that sense. The first one, it promotes and incentivizes sustainable use of biodiversity. It generates income, wealth, and economic security of livelihoods. The second one, it engages private sector actors. We're not talking here about multinational, we're also talking here about small micro SMEs and that are working, or even cooperatives of producers associations that are involved in the conservation of sustainable use of biodiversity and in the access and sharing of the benefits. Number 3 is the sustainable trade leverages additional financial resources and support the mainstreaming of biodiversity. And last but not least, number 4, is trade policy can support phasing out perverse incentives to biodiversity, such as we were, Beatriz also presented before, and Sofia as well. So, and furthermore, maybe even to zoom in, what we can see like our initial brainstorming of how we can contribute is we can share some concrete examples of how we can further contribute to the discussions on board is by sharing best practices, case studies, guidelines, methodologies, and tools, and lessons learned of what worked, what didn't work, on promoting sustainable supply chains, for example, in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America. We also, through the biotrade principles and criteria, we can also provide guidance to actors along the supply chain to become more sustainable and biodiversity friendly. And we can also, based on the experience and the network and the work done not only by, for example, by governments, by NGOs that are implementing the concept of biotrade, but also by the practitioners that are actually in the ground and and having the reality check of what we're promoting and what are the challenges and the opportunities that they're facing. And I think that is really interesting because you get information not only at the local level, but also at the regional level and international level, and then really can enrich like a bottom-up approach for the discussions that can contribute further to the work being done at WTO.
Fantastic.
That's a little, in a nutshell, what I wanted to say. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Lorena. That's perfect. Not even going to summarize that, but simply to say, you know, people listening in, I've seen your colleagues putting some links on the chat. That's fantastic. So please, you know, everybody go, if you haven't already checked the work that UNCTAD has been doing, please go and do so, because it will really give concrete ideas as to how biodiversity and trade can be delivering for both agendas now we move forward. And we just basically need to try to mainstream snowball those experiences when we move towards the 2030. But with that, I say thank you to Lorena and move on to our next panelist, who Lorena already actually referred to. So we have next Anna Batalhone. Anna is Associate Program Officer at the Trade and Environment Program at the International Trade Center, ITC. And those who are slightly less familiar with the trade scene again, ITC is mandated by both the WTO and UN to provide trade-related technical assistance for developing countries. And in this context, ITC works particularly with the business sector and SMEs, supporting them to take advantages of the global trade. And as we will be hearing from Anna next, ITC projects have been supporting synergies between trade, biodiversity, sustainable development agendas on the ground for already a while. For example, working together closely with UNCTAD in the context that Lorena was mentioning. So with that, warm welcome to Anna, and similar question to you as I had for Lorena. Could you summarize ITC's objectives, work linked to biodiversity and trade so far, briefly for our audience, and then kindly reflect what kind of opportunities do you see these new discussions, openings at the WTO offering for particularly perhaps SMEs to engage in sustainable land and natural resource use and biodiversity topics in the future. So Anna, over to you.
Thank you, Marianne. Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. So as mentioned by Marianne, ITC is indeed a joint agency of WTO and UNCTAD, actually. And for us, sustainability is at our DNA. So it's at the core of our DNA, specifically environmental sustainability. Over a decade, we have been working with SMEs and also with business support institutions and policymakers to really enable the conditions for small businesses in developing countries to thrive. And as also mentioned by other speakers, transitioning to a green economy is no longer an option, is a must. And under this context that ITC specifically within its Green to Compete initiative is supporting small businesses in developing countries to adopt green business practices, and by doing so, becoming more competitive in international markets. Our work is centered around three thematic areas: climate change, circularity, and biodiversity. And when it comes to our direct support to SMEs, there are either biodiversity-based SMEs or that have a footprint, a biodiversity footprint that is larger. We work with them to integrate practices to promote sustainable use and conservation of biodiversity, and also such as sustainable harvesting practices or even resource efficient practices that normally we would think this falls under the circularity basket, but we really try to implement a methodology that combines different areas of work and also that tackles the triple planetary crisis, as all the issues are interlinked. When it comes to our work on the policy angle, with the aim to pretty much raise the voice of SMEs and make sure that their perspective is taken into account by policymakers and also ecosystem players that are directly working with the private sector in developing economies. We mainly work through different activities, such as informing national trade and environmental policies, through, for example, the development of green national exports strategies or sector development strategies, also contributing to agenda setting for policymakers. One example of this is through policy briefs, taking into account environmental aspects in a country that we are currently implementing a project, for instance. Participating in discussions, like this one, and also on multilateral processes to bring to the table the perspective of small businesses, and also developing support services and tools whose data and analytics they can inform policymaking. And one of these tools was jointly developed with UNCTAD, the Biotrade initiative of UNCTAD, under the framework of the Global Biotrade Program. This tool is called Biotrade Self-Assessment. It's mainly targeting small businesses and value chains that have strong dependency on nature-based value chains, and enable them to benchmark their sustainability practices against the Biotrade principles and criteria developed by UNCTAD. And this tool is specifically interesting also for actors from the policy domain and also business support institutions, because it also enabled them to set a baseline for the implementation of biodiversity-based development policies, and also has the potential to help them to measure how the impact of this business can be tracked over years, and helped really value chains to give them a north on how to better implement business practices that are aligned with sustainable management of biodiversity. And I think in interest of time, I'll also try to address the second question you asked on the opportunities of the different WTO initiatives on environmental sustainable development. And I'll refer to some of the points mentioned by the other colleagues. For us as ITC, there is a clear opportunity to raise the voice of small businesses, to raise the profile of what are the challenges they have on the ground and what are the opportunities, because they also bring a lot of innovations that can be replicated and can also inspire other countries and other realities, and also help better shape policies that support them in the green transition. Naturally, these initiatives, they also help to raise the profile of trade as a means to achieve better environmental outcomes, specifically in the context of biodiversity, such as sustainable land use and natural resource management. As we know, individually, an SME may not have the same biodiversity footprint as a large business, but knowing that they're the backbone of many economies, it's also important to take into account not only the footprint they have, but also what are the challenges they face when it comes to adopt green production practices. Marianne, I think I'll stop here, I would have other ideas to share, but I think in interest of time, I'll be happy to follow up in the chat as well, in case there are more questions. Thank you.
Fantastic, Anna. Thank you so much for that. And indeed, this is just a bit like a teaser for hopefully the future to come, to have these conversations, when we we have a framework and we start to implement it towards 2030. But the takeaway message from Anna here is, when I reflect this in the context of the 2030 biodiversity framework, is that one of the key elements of the 2030 biodiversity framework aims to do better than its predecessors, is to engage with different actors across the board. And what we hear from Anna is, the importance of SMEs in this context. And you've now kind of gotten to know a couple of actors in Geneva working on these, both UNCTAD and ITC with this community. So I hope that, this can then, again, increase the work in this space in the future moving forward in 2030 context. But with that, big thanks to Anna, and we're going to move on swiftly to our final speaker before some closing remarks from the thesis side. Last but certainly not for least, I would love to introduce you to Ruinstein. Ruinstein is Senior Project Manager at the UNEP-WCMC, so World Conservation and Monitoring Center, and she's one of the lead coordinators for the Trade Hub project that is hosting us today. So very briefly, in a couple of minutes, I've asked Lisen to tell you a little bit about Trade Hub project, if you are not part of it, if you haven't heard of it yet, and then highlight a couple of concrete examples as to how is Trade Hub initiative providing information that supports discussions and action in the biodiversity trade interface moving forward. So Lisen, with that, over to you.
Thanks very much, Marianne. And it's so good to be here in the company of these insightful speakers. I'm very excited. Thank you all for coming. It's so great to have you, really. So briefly about the GCRF Trade Development and the Environment Hub, we call it the Trade Hub. It's a research consortium of nearly 50 partners in over a dozen countries, and it's been established to deliver benefits first and foremost to developing countries by tackling the degradation of the environment and the social inequality that's often associated with trade in agricultural commodity crops and in wild species. Those are the two sort of main areas in which we're working. And what we want to do with the Trade Hub is to support efforts to shift mainstream practice towards the transformation of the economy that takes into consideration trade impacts on nature and people in line with the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and Biodiversity Framework, not least. We're hoping to do that by contributing to positive changes in international agreements, in trade rules, regional trade agreements, and national policies around sustainable production. And we also aim to help the private sector improve its practices in various ways, much like several of the speakers that we've had today. As a research hub, we're here to expand the scientific and technical knowledge base and tools that are available. A large part of our work is research on the impact that trade has on biodiversity and vulnerable people in the countries in which we work. And the other big part is working on a range of options for public and private actors to improve on those impacts. And this includes studies of the effectiveness of different types of policies and practices, including quite extensive modeling work to predict or analyze impacts of different policy options. And for example, colleagues in Indonesia have developed a model to provide recommendations on which political economy and trade factors are the most influential when trying to achieve sustainable trade of palm oil. Our colleagues in Brazil are looking at consequences of international trade rules and global roundtables for soy production and how the resulting agricultural production impacts deforestation in the Brazilian Amazon and the Sahara. And as we've heard from previous speakers, and Beatrice was talking about this, deforestation is obviously a critical measure for how well we treat the environment, with direct implications for climate and biodiversity as well as people. And the Trade Hub has contributed to a number of developments by now for achieving deforestation-free value chains, including inputting to policy initiatives and legislation processes in the EU and in the UK. And as part of this, we're also working with a variety of approaches to help enhance supply chain transparency and traceability, tools that show trade flows of key commodities, and indicators and methodologies that countries, businesses, and finance institutions can employ to identify and monitor their impact. There's a lot that's going on, but just a couple of examples, I suppose. At the national level, we're working with our focal countries to support the review and in some cases reformulation of national legislation around trade and production. It's very interested to hear about other work mentioned here today around that. We're also looking at how legislation in importing countries directly affect the producer country. And we have a stream of work around sustainability standards, as mentioned also today, and how they interact with legislation, opportunities for internationally agreed standards, and work in both, for example, Cameroon and Indonesia on how various certification systems impact smallholders and how they can be improved. So we're very, very happy about the opportunity that TESD presents and to work with all of you to input to these dialogues. And it was especially nice to hear Daniel's list of potential ways of interacting together, facilitating access to key technologies and things like that, which I really hope that we can help with. So it's good to have this really close collaboration that we've got. Thank you, and back to Marianne.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Lisen. We have 1 minute, or maybe, one extra on top of that. And building on what Lisen said, I would like to, as a way of kind of concluding remarks or concluding reflections, hand over to my colleague, Carolyn Deer-Birkbeck from TESS next. Carolyn, I would love you to reflect what's been heard, and particularly maybe reflect that from the perspective of how stakeholders, like those around the virtual table listening today, could now engage in this conversation. What would be your advice? Kind of like call to action in a way. So with that, for 1 minute, final reflections before we close.
Great. Thank you so much, Marianne. And just to quickly close on this point of how can stakeholders and experts like those engaged in this call contribute to these processes. And now Daniel has outlined that the ministerial statements each underline the importance of engagement with stakeholders and recognize the contribution that stakeholders can make to their work. So just my first suggestion on ways forward is for stakeholders to find ways to engage at the national level. Ultimately, it's national governments that engage here at the WTO, and what they really need at the national level is evidence, policy options, and experiences from organizations such as yours that can inform their contributions and engagement in these processes at the WTO. And I think you'll find, especially in developing countries, there's probably a great interest from governments in better understanding what's at stake and what kind of positive agenda they could bring to these discussions. So that's something very, very concrete, and those working nationally are the best positioned to do that. You can also at the national level encourage your ministries focused on biodiversity and climate, for instance, to engage more directly with their trade ministries and vice versa, so that we have a more coherent policy approach at the national level. I think these kinds of roundtables and discussions at the regional level, animated by experience and data from around the world, are really, really important. And I would also note that in some of the new initiatives at the WTO, the members have asked for presentations from stakeholder groups at their sessions and in their plenary discussions as well. So I would keep your eyes open for those opportunities and make sure that your own governments are aware of the work that you're doing, so that perspectives from your regions may also feature in these discussions at the multilateral level. But generally, I think it's a great time, great opportunity. So I'll hand back to Marianne.
Fantastic. Thank you, Carolyn. I think it's definitely worth our while to go those couple of minutes over to really hear these concrete ways forward, how we can engage, otherwise it can remain on a highest level. This simply leaves me with the pleasure of saying thank yous, saying big thank yous to the Trade Hub for hosting us today, saying big thank yous to all the panelists, so Danielle, Beatrice, Sofia, Lorena, Anna, Lisen, and also Carolyn for being with us today. It's been a fantastic lineup, so thank you so much. I think it's been plenty of food for thought for moving forward in the future. It is a very opportune moment, as you've heard. Also, as Danielle said, it feels different. So it's really the moment to start to have these conversations and see how we can snowball what we already have ongoing into something bigger and more comprehensive. So that's what I invite you to do. Taking note of some of the players are on the table, have the conversations, reach out, and as a community, start to work even better together, trade and biodiversity, and moving forward. So with that, I say thank you to all. I look forward to seeing you in person around a virtual table in the future. And I wish you a happy continuation of your morning, day, or evening, depending where you're listening to. Thank you so much.